So I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar this afternoon. My name's Sarah Hale. I work at the German Water Centre, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. For those of you who don't know ZeroPM, that's the reason why we're here. This is the research project that looks at interlinking prevention, prioritisation and removal strategies to protect human health and the environment from these persistent and mobile substances. This is part of our webinar series. We have several webinars, or have had several webinars, and we'll also have many more webinars to come. You can find them all on our YouTube channel if you're interested to watch other ones. But today we're having a webinar called Environmental Psychology Perspectives on Mitigating Environmental Pollution from Perceptions to Behavioural Outcomes. So ZeroPM is a very holistic project and we consider many different parts. Social research is also part of ZeroPM. So today what we're going to be hearing about is insights from the SOS Zero Poll 2030 project. It's a project that I think probably many of you are familiar with. They look at microplastics, PFAS, nutrients and noise pollution, amongst other things, considering risk perception and many more interesting topics. So that's what we'll be hearing about today. We've got three speakers. They all come from the University of Vienna, and that's Valeria, Nina and Sabine. They all work looking at risk perception, communication, behavioural changes, and they not only consider pollution, but they also work on topics like 5G technologies. So they have a very broad background. What I would like is if anybody has a question during the webinar, if you pop it in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen, then we'll do our best to go through all of the questions during the webinar. If not, we'll follow up with you afterwards. We'll release the slides and also a recording of the webinar after the webinar, so you'll be able to listen again. And with that, I am going to hand over now to Sabine to start the presentation for us. So thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sarah. And thank you for inviting us. We're quite excited to present from our sister project on the several pollutants we're comparing there. And of course, microplastics and PFAS are some of the core pollutants we're working on, and that's going to be a special focus. So I'll jump right in. I want to start with a systems view of pollutants and society, because we come from a social science perspective. It's called an environmental psychology perspective. And I want to highlight that in a paper last year we published, we've written an overview of microplastics research, taking a systems perspective. So next, we have taken this picture from this paper, and it shows the system of microplastics pollutants. It's an example for many different pollutants. But basically what you can see here is at the top, we know something about the sources of microplastics. We're obviously interested where these pollutants come from. They are shown to be present in different, in soils, in the ocean, in fish, etc., etc., and of course in humans as well. And we're investigating the harm this has, the impact this has. But what our focus is highlighted in the yellow square below. It's the socio-political dynamic. So we're interested in how this information about presence, about harm, percolates through society and what the consequences are. So on the one hand, we have science communication. People communicate about the science through the media, special interest groups might do so, and they communicate to different groups in society. They could be citizens, they could be the public, they could also be communities and decision makers. And that's important because that might lead to measures and to solutions. And they're listed at the bottom, some examples for potential solutions, potential actions. And what we look at is we're trying to understand what determines the decisions and the actions that come out. So what are the factors that matter when we make these decisions? And there's a little list there, but I want to delve in a bit deeper into this. So next. Because when we talk about behavioral actions, about decisions, often I hear people talk about knowledge. So we need the knowledge. And of course, we need knowledge. We need good data. We need good information. But to determine whether something actually happens, a lot of other factors are important. This is taken from research on the general public. So this doesn't tend to be managers. But we can see here that there's a whole range of things that are important, and they range from concern or risk perception to emotions, not a favorite word in the natural sciences, but they do determine behaviors and actions. They range to values. These are overarching beliefs about the world and what is important to you, to social norms, for example. So I'm more likely to do if a lot of other people do it as well. So this is just a sort of summary of a lot of different literature from the social and behavioral sciences. And it's, of course, also affected by media reporting. So some stories get reported a lot more, some stories less. And also the interest in media comes from these factors again. So next, please. The analytical approaches we take today, this is just a little bit of a highlight, the sorts of questions we ask. There's different things we do. For example, we establish levels of certain outcomes we're interested in, like risk perception. How high is risk perception? We're interested in emotions or affect because we know this is an important factor. And in the level of intentions, are people willing to do something about a risk? And there's an example at the right. That's the sort of thing we might show you. So it's just a descriptive analysis of a level of risk perception or awareness or whatever it is. We're also interested in establishing predictors of these. So how can we explain this level of risk perception? What underlies it? And then it's also important to know that we usually talk about relative importance. There is no way of measuring attitudes or risk perception in absolute terms, like 3.4 grams of negative attitudes. We usually talk about the relative importance because you can't do this absolute measurement. And then we're also interested in understanding pathways to risk perception. I've deliberately chosen this word because I know you're interested in pathways to outcomes. And it's not dissimilar here. So we're interested in modeling the complexity of how different factors influence each other that we can separate in the research. I've put two examples there. One we call mediation, where, for example, affect predicts public policy support, but this works through risk perception. So affect goes directly to risk perception, and that in turn predicts policy support. That's one example for the sort of modeling we do. There's a second type of modeling we do, which is called moderation. So for example, you might find an association between risk perception and policy support, but only for people high in biospheric values. So that tells us something about the groups we need to target. And there's very small, you'll see this in much bigger later. There's an example for that sort of modeling we do. Why do we do this? What's the point? We want to understand the psychology of risk. That's important to us. That's a scientific question. And in an applied sense, we want to use it in communications and in interventions for people. So I mean communications interventions where we have the aim of changing their perception, their understanding, their willingness to engage. So that's a little preview, and I will hand over straight to Nina, who will introduce the sister project.
Thank you very much, and hello from me as well. So the first part we covered already, and now we go with the SOS ZeroPol project. So as Sabine said and Sarah already mentioned, we are all a part of a sister project of ZeroPM called SOS ZeroPol, which aims to establish a zero pollution framework in order to achieve zero pollution in European seas by 2030. And the focus of this project are four pollutants. These are microplastics, PFAS, nutrients pollution, and underwater noise. And what these pollutants have in common, that they could potentially negatively affect the natural environment as well as human health. And they all also have in common that the products they are used for are very, very prevalent in our society. So there is a high dependence. And lastly, there's also scientific uncertainty as to the negative effects of these pollutants, as well as manufacturer doubt. So highlighting this uncertainty to perhaps lag behind with restriction. And in this, so we took the human factor approach. We are environmental psychologists, and we were interested in people's perceptions. And for that, we conducted a large survey in 5 European countries, in Belgium, Bulgaria, Greece, Ireland, and the Netherlands. Our total sample counted 5,206 individuals, and they come from nationally representative samples. We used an online survey conducted between November 2023 and January 2024. And you can also see that the sample is relatively distributed in terms of age, political orientation, and education levels. So we have a relatively good representation of individuals living in these countries. This is how the survey looked like. So we asked a bunch of questions. Some were more related to the pollutants. These are the pollutant-specific factors, such as awareness, knowledge, particularly subjective knowledge, so how much people think they know, affect, this means negative effect or positive effect towards pollutants, risk perception. And then we also asked some more psychological questions, such as what are their values, beliefs, norms, what policies they support, but also trust, techno-optimism, systems thinking. And the data we analyzed in 2 studies for now, and I will present the first study that's focusing on risk perception. And this study describes a cross-country analysis of social, psychological, and pollutant-specific factors of risk perception, comparing all of these pollutants. And first of all, what do we mean with risk perception? Is basically a subjective perception of how risky a substance or a pollutant can be. And on the one hand, we have this objective knowledge, we have risk analysis that tell us how dangerous, potentially dangerous exposure to these pollutants could be. But lay individuals' risk perception is not only based on these objective facts that we get from scientists dealing with these questions, but also on many other factors. So we know that affect is related to risk perception, norms, values, personal experiences, knowledge. This is both what people actually know, but also what people think they know. Trust in different institutions, as well as worldviews, such as we measure techno-optimism and systems thinking. The first one communicates this vision that future technology will solve our current problems, and the second is an understanding that issues that we are facing nowadays are related to each other. And finally, also the demographics play a role or are associated with risk perception. And why are we interested in risk perception anyway? Because it can tell us something about who is more or less likely to support certain policies or perhaps engage in pro-environmental behavior. So we see it as an important indicator for these outcomes. And in the study that I will present now had several research questions, such as what is the level of risk perception for selected pollutants, how important are different pollutant-specific, such as awareness, and general psychological factors, such as values, in predicting risk perception. Are there any differences or similarities in patterns across predictors? And what are the differences between countries? And here I would also like to highlight that we have social science data, particularly on microplastics, and there is less data on other pollutants, from PFAS to underwater noise. And also there is not so much data comparing different countries, so we would really have representative samples across several countries. And I will start with some descriptives. So for instance, we asked, have you ever heard of microplastics, PFAS, nutrient pollution, underwater noise? And here we can see that people are the most aware of microplastics and the least aware of underwater noise. But if we, for instance, zoom into this awareness of PFAS, we see a large difference between Bulgaria, Greece, and Ireland, and Belgium and the Netherlands. Also, this study, keep in mind that the survey was conducted in 2023, 24, beginning of 24. So maybe the media landscape also has changed a little bit in the meantime. So maybe these percentages could be even higher. Then we were wondering, we asked, how have you ever been directly affected by the pollutant in your everyday life? And here we see that most people for most pollutants report rarely being affected by them. Some say never. But we also see relatively high percentages of people saying, I don't know. And this is also an important aspect of risk perception, this uncertainty. Is this something that somehow affects me or isn't it? Again, for PFAS, we see that the percentage in Belgium was the highest for people who said that they were affected. We also see that I don't know responses were slightly more common in Greece, Bulgaria, and Ireland than in Belgium and the Netherlands. And then also more people in Belgium and the Netherlands reported never. So moving on to risk perception. What were the risk perception scores across all these pollutants? What we see is this pattern across countries. So microplastics was perceived as the most risky, followed by PFAS, nutrient pollution, and underwater noise. All these differences were statistically significant across all the countries. This order was the same. However, in Greece, the difference between PFAS and nutrient pollution was not statistically significant. And when I say risk perception, I mean an index that we combined, where we combined three different questions. So concern for health, concern for environment, and the urgency of mitigation. So how urgent they found it to be to tackle and mitigate the pollutant in question. And now coming back to all these different factors, we wanted to understand how much each of this is related to risk perception. And for that, we conducted a multi-level regression model accounting for country belonging. And this is maybe a bit of a complicated visual, but it's a visualization of predictor estimates of risk perception for each pollutant with 95% confidence intervals. In general, you see that the pattern is relatively similar. And here you see a black dotted line. This means that the factor on the left side had no impact, was not related at all to risk perception. However, if the confidence interval is not crossing the black dotted line, then we found a significant effect, either positive or negative. And if we start with sociodemographics, we see that some of them were statistically significant, but these effects, these associations were not very strong. Then we have psychological values, psychological factors, and here the associations were particularly strong with biospheric values, so the extent people value nature, and environmental norms, so to the extent they think that the society is should support pro-environmental action. We also see that trust in government is positively related to risk perception, and distrust in industry is related to risk perception. Finally, we have some pollutant-specific factors, and here negative effect was particularly strongly associated to risk perception, so people that are feeling negatively about those pollutants. Here we also see maybe in knowledge, which is always an interesting factor consider. For underwater noise, this association was stronger than for the other three pollutants. Maybe this makes sense because it's a relatively less known pollutant. And if we include all of these predictors in a regression model, we can explain relatively a lot of variance in risk perception, from 51% to 42, 51 for microplastics to 42 for underwater noise. And then in addition, so this is the unique variance that these factors explain. but we also wanted to look at the relative importance of each of these predictors across environmental pollutants risk perception. And for that, we conducted a relative weight analysis to see what the importance is measured as unique and shared variance that is explained by a factor. And the three most important ones here are affect, so how negatively, in that case, people felt about the pollutant was very strongly associated with risk perception, then biospheric values and norms. And then we also see for microplastics, PFAS, and nutrient pollution, systems thinking, so understanding that environmental issues are related to other issues that we are facing, as well as subjective knowledge were important, whereas for underwater noise, subjective knowledge was relatively more important than for other pollutants. So what can we say based on this data? So in summary, risk perception of environmental pollutants is shaped by both person level factors such as values, affect, knowledge to some extent, and this pollutant level factor. So what sort of negative effects people have if they have ever experienced, have had experience with the pollutant or not. And here we have especially biospheric values, pro-environmental norms, negative affects, subjective knowledge, experience, trust, and systems thinking that are consistently related to risk perception of pollutants. So we found we found some differences, but we also find that perceptions of this pollutant and the factors that predict them are relatively similar across pollutants. A next step would be to look into the relationships of these factors. Now I consider them all at the same level, but the pathways are also something we are interested in, how they interact with each other. How do values affect norms, for instance? We can also, based on this data, we can also see where maybe communication strategies, raising awareness are needed. For instance, underwater noise in some countries also about PFAS. And where maybe policies can be implemented without too much resistance. What is also interesting here maybe is that microplastics is perceived as riskier than PFAS, even though there is perhaps less scientific uncertainty about the harms of PFAS. There's a question why, possibly because microplastics has been a topic of research, also social science research for a while, whereas maybe PFAS is emerging or in the last years becoming a very important topic. Okay, and now I'm handing over to Valeria. I hope the...
Hello from me too. I should now be able to... Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to present you a next step of a second study we conducted concerning behavioral intention. And as also Nina showed us, pollution is one of the most challenging, pressing global challenges. And to design effective intervention to promote environmental behavior, so it's crucial to understand their psychological drivers, so that is why people choose to act or not to act in ways that mitigate environmental impact. So research in social and environmental psychology has demonstrated the contribution of several processes in shaping these behaviors. And one of the most influential framework is to explain the mechanism behind the promotion of pro-environmental behaviors is the value belief norm theory. So here you can see a schematic representation of the original VBN theory as applied to different pro-environmental behaviors. So the model begins with three different types of values: biospheric, egoistic, and altruistic, which influence environmental beliefs such as awareness of environmental consequences and the perceived responsibility for them. These beliefs then activate personal norms, such as a sense of moral obligation to act, which ultimately predict pro-environmental behaviors. While the traditional VBN theory focuses primarily on cognitive and moral components, recent research emphasizes the importance of affective and more experiential processes in shaping environmental decisions. We also saw in Nina's study. And when we talk about affect, we refer to the positive or negative feelings people have towards some things, for example, a sense of worry toward pollution. And these feelings can act like a sort of cues for people, helping them to make rapid interpretation of information and also decide how to respond to these issues. At the same time, we also see that personal experience play a key role in shaping these affective reactions, as well as influencing risk perception. So the goal of this second study was to enhance the VBN theory by integrating also the two additional components of holistic affect and personal experience. And we wanted to test whether these aspects can further explain people's intention to engage in environmental behaviors. So specifically, our first research question addressed the general mechanism, looking at whether personal values indirectly influence behavioral intentions through the combined effects of affect and experience, together with beliefs and norms, as in the original VBN theory. The second question was more pollutant specific, examining whether these relationships hold consistently across different types of pollutants, in our case, microplastics and PFAS. And finally, our third research question focused on cross-country differences, where we tested whether the mediational patterns were consistent across the 5 countries of our sample. So here I'm going to show you our conceptual model, and as shown before, variables were measured through an online survey which included questions for all of these variables, but also for affect, personal experience, and beliefs. We had specific questions for the 4 investigated pollutants. So as you can see, first, we hypothesized that values influence negative holistic affect toward pollutants, which we expected can be also affected by personal experience with those pollutants. Then affect was hypothesized to increase beliefs in terms of risk perception, which consequently would influence personal norms in sense of feeling responsible to reduce pollution. And finally, pro-environmental behavioral intentions were predicted in the model as the final outcome and in our model. So we had different type of behavioral intention, spanning from more personal choice of consumer behavior to more politically engaging behaviors in terms of voting for parties with strong environmental agenda or sign petitions. So we also looked at all the other associations across the variables in the model, as you can see here. So starting from the results concerning the overall distribution of behavioral intentions, participants showed clear differences in their intentions to engage in the different types of behaviors. So specifically, intentions to change personal consumption were significantly higher than intentions to support petitions, and especially higher than voting for pro-environmental parties, which received the lowest score. This may suggest that in general, people may prefer actions that are more directly controllable and immediate compared to those requiring more institutional or political engagement. Looking at a composite score, so a global index of behaviors intention, we can see that there are also some cross-country differences. with participants from Bulgaria, Greece, and Ireland reporting stronger intentions to engage in environmental behaviors overall, while participants from Belgium and Netherlands reported comparatively lower intentions. And this pattern might reflect differences in environmental policies or cultural norms, or also level of environmental concerns across countries. So here you can see a graph showing the correlation among the key variables in our model, and the color intensity represents the strength and the direction of the relationships. So darker reds indicate a stronger positive association, while blue represents negative association, as for the negative correlation between egoistic values and negative affect. So findings showed, as expected, that the relationships across variables followed overall the theoretical prediction of the VBN theory, and we also found support about the correlation between affective, holistic affect toward pollutants and behavioral intentions, so supporting our idea that also emotions can play a key role in motivating environmental actions, as we hypothesized in our extended VBN model. So here I will start showing the findings for the serial mediation model testing the extended value belief norm with all the four pollutants. So first, we looked at how values relate to negative holistic affect in terms of overall negative emotional reaction toward pollutants. And here we found that biospheric values showed a strong positive association, meaning that people who care about the environment tend to experience stronger negative emotions toward pollution. While also altruistic values showed a positive effect on negative holistic affect, indicating that concern for others also contributes to negative affect toward pollutants, though to a lesser extent than biospheric values. In contrast, we can see that egoistic values were strongly negatively related to negative holistic affect, suggesting that people more focused on self-interest experience less negative emotion toward the issue. So next, we see that personal experience with the pollutants also had a significant effect on negative affect. Findings were more complex, but overall we can say that participants who had more personal experience with the pollutants showed also stronger negative emotions toward pollutants. So moving forward in the model, results showed that negative holistic affect significantly increased beliefs of risk perceptions toward pollutants, which in turn also enhanced personal norms in sense of moral obligation to act. Finally, personal norm significantly predicted higher pro-environmental behavioral intentions. So looking at the more indirect effects, so the serial mediation that we hypothesized, we can see that both the key mediation chains were significant. So from values to behavioral intentions through the serial path of affect, beliefs, and norms, as well as the indirect effects from personal experience to behavioral intentions. As I said before, we also examined all the other direct associations between predictors and outcome variables. And as you can see here, the green lines indicate significant positive direct effects, while gray lines show no significant effects. So as you can see, most of the association were in the expected direction and were statistically significant, and this further supports the overall model. And finally, if we look at the explained variance each variables, we can see that the model seems to account for a substantial proportion of in all the key variables. These are quite high values, so this may indicate that the extended model with the addition of affect and personal experience seems to explain a large share of the variability in pro-environmental behavioral intentions. So moving on to the second research question, where we examined whether the model holds consistently across the two specific pollutants of microplastic and PFAS. In this figure, you can see the results of the serial mediation model tested separately across the two pollutants in parallel. So what's important to notice here is that the overall pattern of relationships remain similar to the one we observed in the combined model, including all pollutants. Also, both pollutants show the same significant indirect effects, suggesting that the underlying mechanism driving behavioral intentions are quite stable across pollutants, regardless of the type of threat. Then, when we look at all the other possible direct effects, we again found a very similar pattern to the general model, where most associations were significant, as shown by the green lines. If we have a closer look on the pollutant-specific variables, we see that both show comparable levels of explained variance, as well as similar coefficients across outcomes, and so this seems to act and work quite similarly. So finally, we looked at the third research question concerning the generalizability of the model across country. And in this table, we summarize the main results for both the overall mediation as well as the mediation across pollutants. And we can say that overall findings showed a high degree of consistency of the model across country for the main mediation pathways that is mostly consistent in all the countries that we had in our sample. But we did observe some country-specific differences, such as in Belgium and Bulgaria, the indirect effects from altruistic values did not reach significance. Also, for the pollutant-specific models with microplastic and PFAS, the significance of some indirect effects varied across pollutants among countries. So to conclude, we can say that integrating experiential factors into the value belief norm theory improved its explanatory power, offering a deeper understanding of what drives pro-environmental behavioral intentions. So from a theoretical perspective, this study extends the traditional model, showing that these components meaningfully complement the traditional cognitive and moral component of the model. Then our findings also show that the mechanisms remain highly consistent across pollutants, suggesting that the same psychological processes may operate across different environmental threats, which strengthens the model's generalizability, but also this consistency is encouraging because it suggests that established theoretical framework like the VBN theory can also help us explain responses to emerging or less familiar pollutants. At the same time, while the model was generally consistent across countries, some differences were found, suggesting that some more contextual factors may also influence the relative weight of those pathways and these associations. So future research is needed also on those cross-country differences to further investigate how local interventions should adapt to emphasize the most important drivers in each context. So I think we'll now let Sabine finish and our presentation.
Thank you, Valeria. Can you move it forward one more?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, first of all, Nina and Valeria. This was a really deep dive into the data we have in the sister project as a ZeroPol, and particularly the latter half of the presentation. This is super fresh data. We haven't actually presented this to anyone yet, so this is a first. And I also want to thank you, Elise and Matt, who are listening, I think, who are part of the University of Vienna team, who have had an input in all of this. So if I just step back a little bit and think about some conclusions from this, of course, first of all, we wanted to introduce you to an environmental psychology perspective, and that's also a social science perspective, a behavioral science perspective. Unfortunately, there are many labels for this sort of thing that we do. There are two sort of conclusions based on what we heard, the new data. Risk perception is driven by affect, values, and norms. Those were the most important factors. Knowledge was a little bit behind that. That's Nina's part. And then in Valeria's part, a very theory-driven approach where adding affect, so this emotional dimension, improves our prediction of behavioral outcomes. So that's, in a nutshell, what I think we can take away from that. There are, of course, some strengths and some weaknesses, and I am used to these discussions in an interdisciplinary context. I think some of the good things about our sample are that they're large samples, they're representative on a number of things. They're also cross-country, so there's quite a lot we can do with this. And because they're fairly large, we have good statistical power. We have no worry about the robustness of these findings. And I also want to point out that we use open science principles. So we pre-register our analyses, we think very carefully what we're going to do, and then we follow this. Or if we deviate, we really try to justify and say the data just didn't come out, it didn't have these characteristics that we expected, for example. So this is all very transparent. There are, of course, limitations, and again, have had many of these discussions. The first thing to say about this particular data, it's cross-sectional, completely cross-sectional. We cannot make firm conclusions about anything to do with causality. We can look to other data sets, we can look to theory, but at the end of the day, these are all associations. And of course, that's the second limitation I want to state. They're self-report data. But at the same time, I want to say to you, if you're interested in these processes underlying what leads to risk perception, what leads to behavioral intentions, what other way is there to get at this level? So tell me, give me some ideas how we can do that. Finally, I also want to say, of course, we're working in a strong framework of scientific evidence. So we need to know where things are found, where are pollutants present, at what level, at what thresholds, etc. But we also need to consider the socio-political level. Think back to the very first slide I showed, because we risk solutions or measures not working if we don't consider people's responses. And if we don't consider that maybe they're super emotional about this, and we're coming in with knowledge, with information, we're also risking a loss of trust, for example, for government, if we don't communicate well, and we're risking a loss of reputation. This is often an issue for industry more, again, if we don't take this into account. So it's really valuable to think about these other softer social factors. And then finally, I just want to say, let's work together across disciplines and sectors to unravel this and make the world a bit safer and healthier for everyone. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much. That was really great, Sabine, Nina, and Valeria. And yeah, it was just a lot of thoughts coming into my head while I was listening to that. And we are now open for questions. And if anybody would like to have any questions about these presentations, please write them in the chat and I will read them and we'll get a chance to answer them. And so our very first question, then looking at the Q&A, this comes from our work package 3 leader, Elise, who's based in Belgium, and I can see where her question's coming from, and I might expand on that a little bit. She wanted to know, like, you use these 5 countries, but she wants to know, did you consider all the region where participants lived? In Belgium in 2023, someone from Antwerp was likely more aware of and affected by PFAS than someone from the other parts of Belgium because of the pollution hotspot in Zwijndrecht. And just to expand on that, I know, yeah, Belgium and also Netherlands. Netherlands has an area called Dordrecht, and both of these areas has been in the local news a lot, and it's quite upsetting and emotional. So I think that might guide the personal experience people might have with knowing what the dangers of PFAS, for instance. But so I guess the question is like, have you seen any say regional influences within the country? I guess is part one, and part two that I would like to add is do you see the existence of a PFAS hotspot as influencing the data that you saw?
I'll give that question to Nina, I think. An excellent question.
Well, we found this question very interesting ourselves, so we wrote up a pre-registration document. So we are interested in looking at the differences within Belgium, so regions like Antwerp, where there was either a presence of a factory where a spill became known, or there was like higher blood levels, and in Netherlands again, trying to operationalize which regions to compare with each other. I have to say that it was not an easy task because probably you know it's quite difficult on a regional level to separate those regions. However, we do have a plan. We wanted to officially pre-register it before we look into the data so that the whatever results we come up with are potentially stronger. But yeah, we will make within country comparison as well as then some follow-up between country comparison, especially looking at regions that we identified as potentially where the either a media presence or other regulations or due to factory spills are where like PFAS is more present in people's minds at least, as well as bodies. Yeah.
Maybe just to add, it would be interesting to see Lise's view on this as well. So if it's okay, we might contact you to have this discussion because, like Nina just said, it's the media exposure and the actual presence, and it's also a dynamic process because the data is a few years old, and we try to match it exactly to that point in time. So I'd be interested in carrying on this discussion as well.
No, great. Thanks so much. No, so let's up to the next question. It's the second. Oh, there's more coming in. Okay, good. But I'll just read it as appears on the screen. It's from Patrick Morgan. Within the VBN study, can you input information or correct the model based on participant bias, where subjective understandings towards personal behavior changes are thought to be higher than actual behavior changes? For example, people often think they are changing behavior due to specific issues, such as reducing plastic use due to plastic pollution, more than actual use data on a national level shows. That's a tricky question. Any takes on that?
Yeah. I can reply to that. And I mean, this is unfortunately a known limitation of self-reported data, where participants can often overestimate their pro-environmental behaviors, such as for social desirability or also subjective perception, wrong subjective perception of their actions. So we acknowledge that this could be a limitation, and we don't actually have data on actual behavior. So we don't know if this intention, self-reported intention, will transform in actual behaviors. So yeah, we cannot directly adjust the model without having this objective behavioral data. But I will say this is a standard limitation for survey-based research in psychology. So we will, of course, acknowledge that in the limitation of the study. And so this, of course, limits also the interpretation of our findings. Yeah, thank you for the question.
If I may also just to add a little bit to that, it's actually also tricky to think really what are the behaviors we want to focus on. I mean, there's a separate set of studies we've been involved in, we've done in the past, where we look at particular behaviors, even observable. For example, we look at the amount of plastic waste in bins, where we go to a bin analysis and we count what's in the bins. But I think it's really not super obvious, for example, for PFAS, how we should approach this. Again, I'd be keen on having some ideas. I mean, the only thing I can think of is where people maybe avoid buying things with PFAS content. but it's really tricky to say this is the one behavior we focus on, or this is the range of behaviors. But I'm happy to receive suggestions on this.
Great. Now then I think we'll go to the next question, which I think is, if I interpreted it correctly, it's in maybe with some related to a point you brought in your introduction, Sabine, about manufacturing doubt. This is by Gabriela Hoffman. When I think of the PFAS restriction, the influence of the lobby people is above all other influence, it seems. I assume this is implying in the industry lobbyists. This is not represented in your data?
Shall I try that? No, it's not. I mean, we could represent it again, perhaps by thinking about trust in industry, and we have trust in industry. Maybe Nina, you want to jump in as well. But I just wanted to say this is a huge, huge issue, and we're doing quite a bit of research around uncertainty in communications, and we want to look more into sources of information. So there we could unpack what people think. So if someone from industry tells them this is not a problem, don't worry about it, we can rely on data from the climate sector where we've got some experience in dealing with skepticism. This is not really represented at the moment in the pollutant literature, but it's a really excellent idea to look into that much more. So, Nina, did you want to add? Sorry.
Not much, except that we found this negative association. So those who trusted industry less were also more likely to perceive higher risks with respect to pollutants. So this is somewhat there, but yeah, not to the extent where we could see how people respond to these messages coming from the lobbying sectors.
No, and maybe I'll just add a reaction to that. I think also when it comes to the issue of manufacturing doubt, I think sometimes the goal of those who have that, say, as their agenda is not to say there's no risk, but rather often it's to say we don't know what the risk is, or the science is not there yet. At least that's what I experience anecdotally. So I wonder sometimes if the effect to analyze of manufacturing doubt is the opinion of uncertain risk versus no risk, or yes, there is a risk.
Yeah, it's basically about somehow abusing this scientific uncertainty that is always present and highlighting it to the extent that then no consensus is there, or at least it's represented in that way. I think I have also heard anecdotally that in case of PFAS, this was very strong for a while, emerging in the 90s and so on. Yeah, but also climate change has a similar path. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Next question from Alexander Scott. The survey included questions about perceived impact. Was there any way to tell how accurate these perceptions were, as opposed to measuring the readiness to assign blame correctly or not?
Does anyone want to answer this? I mean, not really. We try quite carefully overall in our research to align this. So even if we don't have a direct comparison, we try to then integrate it into the literature and say, people are saying, for example, I'll take an example. We have a paper on microplastics and human health effects, and this is a few years old actually, and we simply wanted to hear what people were concerned about. And of course, sometimes there are hypotheses that aren't borne out in any scientific evidence. So even if we can't tell for any individual participant, this is correct, incorrect, we can then comment on this in the interpretation of the results. And in that particular study, we did also obtain an objective knowledge scale, and we tried to relate it together. So that's the best answer, I guess, I can give.
Great. No, thanks. Now go to this next question. I think this is interesting because this is something I thought about for a while. It's from, I might be pronouncing this wrong, but Helwaz Thoumont. Microplastics can be visible or linked to the visible plastic pollution, while PFAS, nutrients, and underwater noise have less tangibility. Could you think this limited chance to perceive the pollutions to lack of personal experience for these three pollutants?
I can start, and then, I think that's why we are seeing this very high levels of I don't know responses. So I think people are on some level aware. Maybe some people have live in a region of Belgium where they were told that they shouldn't consume their eggs, and they could say, okay, this was an actual experience. But otherwise, I think they imagined that these chemicals potentially could enter their body somehow. They maybe read about microplastics in their brain, but they actually don't know. So it's more like a very, yeah, it's not really tangible. And I think we see that descriptively in the I don't know responses. Yeah, maybe you want to add something, Sabine and Valeria.
No, I agree with that. Sorry, Valeria.
Yeah, I was saying, yeah, I agree with Nina's comment. Yeah.
Great. No, yeah, thanks. No, I mean, this is something, at least in the science communication of what we do in ZeroPM. In other ways, we're trying to make the invisible visible, to put it on the same platform as microplastics. So I'm just going to go to the next question by Xavier Weithen. Do the communication through social medias influence more the perception of risk than official press and communication? Oh, here we go again, making the invisible visible. But yeah, the methods of communication.
I'm not sure we can say. I mean, there's communication sciences, and I think they try to compare this to some degree, but we have no data on social media. Anecdotally, of course, we get these trends, we get these fads, perhaps. I don't think we have an answer to that, or I don't anyway. Maybe someone else has.
No.
Yeah. No, but that is an interesting question, I think, also just in the sense that as it goes to social media, more people see the message, but maybe the nuances of the message get lost and things get simplified, and interesting. Yes, so next question from Bjorn Hitting. I could imagine that certain behaviors are better suited to contribute more significantly to a specific problem solution than others. Would you agree on this hypothesis? If so, how could this be applied better in practice?
I think that comes back to what I said earlier, that it's sometimes difficult to know exactly what to do. And this is something we're in the team really interested in working on. There is some analysis, again, in the climate change domain, where you look at behavior from two perspectives. One is, what is the impact potentially when people change their behavior in large numbers? And we know reducing meat, for example, has a big effect on emissions. Mobility is another big contributor. And I sort of imagine a similar analysis in this domain, but at the moment, this is quite tricky. It's hard to pinpoint this. I'm not sure I'm answering this exact question, but I think it relates to the same point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add that when talking about the model that we actually tested, we had more generic behaviors. So more generally speaking about environmental behavioral intentions toward deal with pollution, but seeing the different paths across pollutants, we can see that they had like a quite similar effect on this outcome. So maybe they can also act together in improving environmental behavioral intention, apart from different types of behavior that, of course, would be interesting to explore. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, very good. And I had a burning question, but I see that time is over. And we like to be on time with these webinars. So then again, I'll just thank you once more, Sabine, Valeria, and Nina, for this very insightful presentation. It gave us a lot to think about, and also I think engage more about how we can use the tools of environmental psychology in a holistic manner to tackle pollution situations at the societal level. So I think this was really interesting and meaningful. And I'm just going to also say, if you're interested in more about PFAS and persistent mobile pollutants, please look at our work at the ZeroPM project at zeropm.eu. We also have a YouTube channel where this webinar will be posted afterwards, along with our previous webinars. So please look out for that and follow us on LinkedIn for further updates. And so for me and Sarah Hale and everyone else in ZeroPM, thank you much for tuning in today.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
ZeroPM, zero pollution of persistent and mobile substances. This project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under grant agreement number 101036756.